6 more 100% cotton papers you should try. Do you want to see more 100% cotton watercolor papers in action? I've been painting with watercolors for a while now, but I've never tried the vast range of papers out there, especially not all in one go like I've been doing in these videos. I've already tested one batch of papers in this earlier video, including bringing them on a family cruise to Alaska, and now I'm excited to put another batch of 100% cotton papers to the test. Like before, I'm going to include arches because that's what I've used for years. The other 5 are all new to me, and I thought it would be interesting for you to see how they perform. I'm literally trying them all out for the first time to see which ones appeal to me. So these are the 5 new papers I'll be testing: Leyton, Saunders Waterford, Arches, Winsor Newton Professional, Flunbrato and Hahnemühle Collection. Many of you raised these brands in the comments, so thank you. There are definitely more that I'm not covering here, and I've been taking note of your suggestions. Maybe one day I'll get to them all, and if you subscribe, you'll see them in an upcoming video. Anyway, so far I've enjoyed a few of the brands from my previous tests, and I'm excited to find more that I can work with. As before, I'm going to introduce the papers in order of least expensive to most expensive. Just a couple of thoughts before we get into the different brands. Sizing. I know sizing is important to many painters, but it's not always easy to find out this information. I gathered the info either from the brand's websites or a distributor's website, or by reaching out to their marketing or customer service folks directly. Also, I've always thought that I could paint on any paper, but these tests have shown me that that's not always true. For instance, the Bahong Artist paper that I tried recently, it just isn't my cup of tea. It might be yours, but I think just for my own style, I just really don't like it that much. All right, let's meet these new papers. This first one is Leyton. It's a watercolor block, 20 sheets. It's actually 160-pound paper. This brand doesn't have a website, but according to their Australian distributor, the company was founded by an artist named Shi Junxian, who has roots in the ancient paper town of Jiajiang, China. They say that this watercolor paper is made from long 100% cotton fibers, allowing it to absorb a lot of water without warping or causing the colors to bleed. Leyton is sized with gelatin, which means it includes animal elements, so it's not vegan friendly. So at $17.99 US and 20 sheets, it's about 90 cents US per sheet. This Flunbrato watercolor block is another 100% cotton paper out of China. It's 9 by 12, it has 24 sheets. Like Leyton, Flunbrato doesn't have a website, but it distributes through various online retailers. They say this is an artist-grade sketchbook. It comes with a faux leather cover and an elastic closure band that makes this stylish and portable. And they say their cold press paper provides the perfect balance between texture and control, allowing for smooth washes, layering, lifting, and fine detail work. In full disclosure, this was sent to me recently and I didn't promise to review it, and they don't know I'm making this video. For all of the other papers in this test, I went out and purchased them. I confirmed with them directly that the paper is both internally and surface sized, and it's gelatin free and contains no animal derived ingredients, so the paper is vegan. At $24.99 US and 24 sheets, this comes out to about $1.04 US per sheet. This is the Hahnemühle Collection Watercolor 300 paper. It's 9 by 12 inches. They say their prized cotton papers, which come in 300 GSM or 600 GSM, are characterized by a very durable paper surface that's well suited for demanding watercolor techniques. The fibers don't lift, rub off, or loosen even when applying multiple layers of color or when using masking fluids and tapes. For sizing, they claim to be the first paper manufacturer worldwide to produce exclusively vegan papers. They state that animal glues made of gelatin or substrates of animal origin are banned from Hahnemühle papers. At $17.22 US and 12 sheets, this comes out to about $1.43 US per sheet. Next is Saunders Waterford. This is a 140-pound, 100% cotton watercolor block. They say it's an exquisite English watercolor paper, traditionally made on a cylinder mold machine. They say each sheet is buffered with calcium carbonate to help defend finished pieces of work from discoloration caused by acids present in pollution. This paper uses gelatin surface sizing. They say that the gelatin used at the paper mill, which is called St. Cuthbert's Mill, is bovine in origin and a byproduct of the meat industry. So clearly it's not vegan. At $35.15 US and 20 sheets, this comes out to about $1.75 US per sheet. Number 5 is Winsor Newton Professional watercolor paper. This is a block as well. They say this 100% cotton paper is crafted in Italy by the art paper making experts on a traditional cylinder mold and offers the highest quality surface for smooth, even washes, preserving luster and transparency of color. For sizing, they say it's both internally and externally sized for optimal absorbency and extreme strength. I actually emailed customer service about their sizing, and they confirmed that they can't claim vegan status, but that it's a proprietary blend of vegetable and synthetic sizing. At $42.75 US and 20 sheets, this comes out to about $2.13 US per sheet. Finally, we have this Arches watercolor block. I've shown this before. According to them, this naturally white, acid-free sheet is sized with natural gelatin that penetrates to the core, providing outstanding absorbency and a consistent texture. Before we move on to the paper tests, if you've learned something so far, would you give this video a thumbs up? And if you learned 2 or more things by the end of this video, would you consider subscribing to show your support? Thank you so much. Now let's go and test these papers. Like the other tests I did, I drew 2 squares on each paper. I know some of you are tired of these squares and want more than just filling in these boxes, but I'm going to stick to these to stay consistent across my various tests. In another video, I'll try to test the papers out more with fuller painting attempts, and I'll come back with results like how I did with the Alaskan cruise video. All right, so now we're going to start with the Leyton watercolor block. I'm going to do my usual wet on dry first. No complaints so far about how that's going on. Now I'm going to do wet on wet by putting a layer of water down first on the paper. And then I'm putting some pigment into the square. And we'll let that dry. Now onto the Hahnemühle Collection paper. I'm going to do the wet on dry and fill this square. And then I'm going to do wet on wet. Just filling this square with water. And then applying pigment into it. And now the Saunders Waterford, wet on dry. And then wet on wet. Just applying some water first into the square. Then I'm going to drop pigment into this. Now onto the Flunbrato paper, wet on dry. Now wet on wet. And now for the arches paper, wet on dry. And now wet on wet. All right, now we're to the last paper, Winsor Newton Professional. We're going to do the wet on dry. And then wet on wet. Now we'll let these dry and I'll come back and do a couple other techniques like I've done on the previous tests. So it's been 30 minutes since I painted these squares, and let's see how these papers performed so far. That's the Leyton, the Saunders Waterford, the Arches, Winsor Newton, Flunbrato, and the Hahnemühle Collection. Now, a couple of things I notice is that the texture of the paper shows through differently on each of these papers. The least evident, I think, is in the Arches paper, but here in the Winsor Newton, the texture of the paper really shows through, and it's kind of an interesting look there, looking at the wet on wet square. In the Flunbrato, the texture of the paper really shows through. In the Hahnemühle, also the texture of the paper is showing through there. And definitely in the Leyton paper on the wet and wet square. And you can see in the Arches, you see pretty much of all the papers, the least amount of the texture of the paper is showing through. So now I'm going to try some lifting technique, similar to what I did in the previous videos. I'm going to use my semi-moist brush to lift out a line from the squares, and let's just see how easy or difficult it is. And I'm wiping it off after every couple of strokes. That's the Leyton. Now I'm going to move on to the Hahnemühle. Now to the Saunders Waterford paper. The Saunders Waterford definitely seems to be the harder one to lift out the pigment, in both squares. Now let's go to the Flunbrato. In general, I think lifting is a little bit harder in the wet on wet squares because there was a lot of water to begin with and the pigment soaks into the fibers more. But that one is definitely easier than the Saunders Waterford. Now to the arches. Also harder on the arches paper to lift out in the wet on wet square. Finally, the Winsor Newton. The pigment on the Winsor Newton is definitely coming out pretty well. Not very hard. Now let's try the wet on wet square. All right, so that wasn't that hard to lift out. Clearly, the Saunders Waterford wet on wet square was the hardest for me to lift out pigment from. All right, so I'm going to let these dry a little bit longer and we'll come back and I'll try to blend some of the hard edges into the blank paper Okay, so it's now been over an hour since I last did the lifting technique on all of these squares, and I'm gonna now do what I did before, which is use my brush to reactivate the hard edge of the top square on each paper and just see how the paper performs and to see how easy or hard it is to blend the hard edge into the blank paper. So I'm just going to moisten my brush and just ever so slightly go along the edge of the square and try to coax that paint out. And we'll just let that rest, and it should, in a few minutes, it should seem fuzzier, more diffused. And I'm going to move on to the Hahnemühle Collection and do the same thing here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the Saunders Waterford. And then the Flunbrato. And then let's do the arches. And then finally, the Winsor Newton. All right, let's go back and take a look at the Leyton. This is a pretty subtle technique, so the results are not drastic, but hopefully you can see some diffusing going on where the edge of the square is just a little bit softer. I think with the cotton papers doing this it lends itself to a more subtle effect than if you did it on a wood pulp paper. We have a little bit more control when we're applying the wet brush to the paper. So on the wood pulp paper, the water stays on the surface a bit more, so it may like just flow into the painted area of the square against your will, basically. But here, pretty much consistently across these cotton papers, the effect is pretty subtle, so I think that's a good sign. Now, here's what happens if I actually try to purposely disturb and reactivate it a lot more. So that's the effect on the Leyton and then the Hahnemühle. The Flunbrato. This is actually useful for seeing how the paint will behave after it's put down, and as you progress in a painting, you may end up disturbing it more, and this is useful for seeing how it will look in that case. Now the arches. Now doing this on a wood pulp paper, you probably could disturb it a lot more easily, but the effect might be a little bit more drastic. And then on the Winsor Newton, let's do the same thing. What's nice about doing this on the cotton papers overall is you can get the paint to blend pretty nicely into the surrounding area, even after it's dried a bit. And then the Saunders Waterford. I'm happy to say that there's really not that much to report here in this test, in that, again, I'm not trying to show you all what I think is the best paper. I'm literally just trying out these papers for the first time and letting you kind of witness what it seems, what it appears to be to me. And I am definitely full of my own biases. I have been using Arches for many years, and I never really just went out and did this kind of test, a full-blown test of techniques across all different kinds of papers. It's expensive to get all these papers, but I figured, hey, why not try this in front of you and let you witness what it's like. It's okay if we don't really have strong opinions about any of these, especially since the differences aren't so drastic. I mean, some of the textures kind of stand out to me a little bit, but I do wonder if I painted on these papers a little bit more, whether I would get used to it and if it would just kind of not really register to me as much if I kept using it. For example, also on the Flunbrato, I felt like the texture really stood out a lot more in the beginning, but as it's dried, it's getting less and less noticeable to me. The funny feature, the funny way that the Winsor Newton paper dried on the wet and wet square, it could have its own character given the right subject matter. So all of this is very subjective, and even though I have been using Arches all these years, I'm not saying that it's better. I just like it, and maybe it's just my own preference, and maybe I will start using some of these other papers more. Who knows? But I do have a lot of Arches paper that I need to get through, so I also don't want to waste it. I would say, perhaps out of all of these, the one that stands out to me the most in terms of how the paper looks in the end is the Leyton. I like the wet on dry appearance, but maybe the wet on wet square is probably my least favorite of all of these. But again, depending on the subject matter and the style, perhaps it would work better. So again, this is all subjective, and you should take away from it what you need. And if this even just confirms the paper that you use, that you like it and there's nothing wrong with it, that's cool. Now I know these are just squares that I've filled in, and it's a very limited demonstration of these papers. I do plan to paint more on these papers, and really it just takes a bit of time. I think spending time with each of these papers, getting to know them really well. Right now I've just met these. Maybe you've only met them too as well. So it's almost impossible for me to convey to you fully what each of these papers is like. So if there is one that interests you or that is more accessible to you, go out and get it and try it and let me know how it works for you. I'm glad I got to finally try out all these papers like this. It's been a pleasure sharing the results with you. Hopefully these tests will be good reference points as you go out and experiment on these papers yourself. Ultimately, you have to find what works for you and your style. We all have different preferences, but there's a world of papers out there that may or may not actually help and improve your painting experience. Only you can tell that. Out of these papers in this video, I can say I'd be happy to work with any of them, but painting squares on these papers is not necessarily the same thing as completing full-fledged paintings. So I'm going to spend some time with all of them, all the ones that I've tested so far, and see where they take me. That's the beauty of this thing called art. There are so many ways we can express ourselves, and that includes the supplies and materials that we choose. Now, I can't objectively tell you which one of these is best, but I know you'll understand if I say that the right tools will choose you. Keep an eye out for future videos where I show you how these papers continue to perform as part of my art practice. If you're just getting started or you're looking for a simple approach to get back to watercolors after some time away, I've put together a free one-page chart of essential supplies. Just click on the link in the description to download it. I'm Francis Shui, a working artist based here in New York City. Like, share, and subscribe if this helped, and hit the bell icon to get notified of future videos. Until the next time, go and paint.